If you step into the world of Tudor England, long before the hum of refrigerators and the silence of modern kitchens, you would be struck not by the sight of the food, but by the sound. The kitchen was alive with a roar that never stilled. The moment you crossed its threshold, the din surrounded you. It was not simply one sound, but dozens layered together, each competing for space, each demanding to be heard. There was the crack and roar of open fires, the scrape of iron pokers striking against logs, the constant hiss as fat dripped onto flames. Above it all, voices rose, sharp with urgency, cooks shouting for more water, boys darting with messages, servants repeating orders before they could be forgotten. This was no quiet chamber of culinary art. It was a battlefield of sound, and at its heart, the Tudor kitchen pulsed with relentless life. The space itself invited noise. Kitchens in the palaces of Henry VIII or in the halls of wealthy noblemen were cavernous chambers, often vaulted with high ceilings meant to contain heat, but that instead magnified every clang. The stone walls threw sound back at the workers, bouncing it from corner to corner until it was impossible to tell who had spoken first or from where the order had come. One man's muttered command could become a bark. One dropped ladle a ringing alarm. Noise became a companion, one you could not ignore. Even silence, when it fell for the briefest instant, felt unnatural, as if something had gone terribly wrong. At the center of it all, the fire dominated. Fires in Tudor kitchens were no small hearths. They were enormous constructions of brick and stone, built wide enough to roast whole sides of beef, to hang geese and swans on spits that had to be turned by hand or by dog-powered wheels. The fire did not whisper but roared, a constant rush of breath as wood caught and consumed itself. The cooks fed it endlessly, throwing on logs so heavy that two men had to lift them together. Each addition brought sparks, each shift of embers a crackling reminder that heat, like hunger, never slept. Beside the fire, spits clanked as they rotated. Chains groaned, metal scraped against stone, and the steady rhythm of turning meat added its own percussion to the symphony. Noise also came from tools. Tudor kitchens were filled with instruments that had no softness. Mortars pounded spices into dust, pestles striking stone in rhythmic thuds. Knives chopped against wooden blocks, cleavers slammed into carcasses, iron cauldrons were dropped onto hooks with ringing force. Lids clattered, spoons scraped against the bottoms of pots, ladles sloshed through bubbling stews. Nothing was quiet because nothing was designed to be quiet. Iron and stone were the language of the kitchen, and their speech was always harsh. Even footsteps added to the uproar as boys ran across flagstones with hurried slaps of bare feet or clumsy boots. The people themselves carried noise in their very breath. Cooks shouted to be heard over fire, over pounding, over chopping. Instructions were repeated and barked until they became echoes of themselves. Quarrels broke out when orders were not obeyed quickly enough, and the sharp retort of anger mixed with the laughter of others who found amusement in the chaos. Servants called to one another from opposite ends of the room, each certain their task was the most urgent. A boy sent for water might shout as he pushed through, carrying a heavy pail that threatened to tip with every step. A scullery maid might curse as her cloth slipped from greasy hands, her voice lost in the general clamor. To survive in this kitchen, you had to learn to shout, to endure shouting, and to find your place within a wall of sound that never gave way. Animals, too, contributed their voices. Dogs, chained near the roasting spits, barked and whined as they trotted endlessly to turn meat. Chickens clucked and flapped in baskets awaiting slaughter. Pigs squealed in distant yards before being brought inside. Even rats had their own chorus, scurrying and squeaking in the shadows, their presence never entirely banished no matter how clean the servants tried to keep the stores. The kitchen was not a sterile chamber. It was a living ecosystem, and its creatures added their cries to the mix. The smells that filled the space made the noise sharper, as if your senses could not separate one from the other. Fat sputtered as it fell into fire, releasing smoke that carried the scent of roasting flesh. Spices, when pounded, filled the air with sharp sweetness, mingling with the bitterness of singed bread or the sour tang of spilled ale. The mingling of smells made one's head heavy, and in that heaviness, the sounds became even more overwhelming. To stand in a Tudor kitchen was to stand inside a storm of the senses, and the storm did not abate. Imagine, then, the toll upon the body. Day after day, workers endured this din, their ears battered by the constant roar. There was no escape, for to step outside was to be summoned back within moments, carrying more wood, more water, more flour. Noise sank into bones as much as into ears, leaving men and women exhausted not only by labor but by the unceasing assault of sound. Yet they accepted it. Noise was proof that work was being done, that fires burned, that meals prepared for kings and lords would reach their tables in time. Quiet would have been far more dangerous, for quiet meant something had gone wrong. And still, as you linger upon this scene, you might wonder, if kitchens of the past roared so loudly, how did the cooks themselves think clearly? How did they taste, plan, or create in such confusion? Did they not lose themselves in the clamor? Or did noise itself become a tool, a rhythm by which they measured time, judged readiness, and kept the vast operation in motion? The clamor of a Tudor kitchen was not an accident. It was the natural result of scale. Few people today imagine the sheer size of the operation required to feed a household of power in the 16th century. A nobleman's hall, or worse still, the court of Henry VIII, demanded meals of staggering abundance. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of dishes needed to appear in synchronized fashion, all steaming hot, all perfectly seasoned, all arriving with precision. It required armies of cooks, scullions, spitboys, bakers, and brewers, each working at once. The more people who labored in one place, the louder it became. Words were not spoken gently. They were hurled like missiles across the chamber, aimed to strike above the noise of pounding, roasting, and boiling. Sound became the only way to enforce order. The hierarchy of this space was shouted into being. At the top stood the master cook, a figure of immense authority, charged with overseeing the chaos. His voice carried over all others, and his orders were absolute. Beneath him stretched a ladder of responsibility. Each level barked commands at the next, a descending chain of shouts and replies. To miss an order was unthinkable, for the failure of a dish, the lateness of a course, could mean disgrace before noble guests or even dismissal. The very structure of the kitchen depended upon noise as communication. In a world without timers, without machines, without printed lists pinned to walls, memory and the human voice were the tools of command. Consider the spitboys, perhaps the most miserable of all the kitchen staff. These children, often no more than 8 or 9 years old, were tasked with turning the enormous spits of meat before the fire. They did so by hand, sitting for hours as heat blistered their faces and smoke stung their eyes. In larger kitchens, dogs ran inside wooden tread wheels, their padding feet providing the motion needed to turn spits mechanically. The boys, however, were still everywhere, their job thankless and brutal. And like all children, they did not suffer in silence. They complained, they cried, they bickered with one another, their voices rising shrill above the low rumble of adult orders. In their tones of fatigue and protest, another layer of sound was added to the storm. The scullery was no quieter. There, the lowest servants toiled at endless washing. Mountains of pots, cauldrons, spits, and trenchers awaited their hands. They scrubbed with sand and ash, scraping grease from iron, beating cloths against stones, their work a constant rhythm of scraping, sloshing, and banging. Water sloshed into troughs, buckets were overturned, pans were flung aside to dry. Even their breath came loud, panting with exertion, groaning under the weight of cauldrons carried to and fro. This noise was not as commanding as the master cook's shout, but it was relentless, an undertone of labor that never ceased while the kitchen lived. In the bakehouse, flour dust rose and voices coughed against it. Kneading was done with force, fists striking dough with dull thumps, boards creaking under the strain. Ovens, massive brick chambers heated with wood, demanded attention, and when loaves were slid in or drawn out, the scraping of paddles against stone rang sharp. The baker called out warnings to keep children from running too close, lest they burn themselves, his words half lost in the din. Each action had its sound, each sound multiplied by a dozen hands repeating the same task. What began as one baker's noise became a chorus when half a dozen men performed the same rhythm side by side. Above all of this, the architecture itself conspired to make the noise unbearable. Tudor kitchens were rarely small. They had to be vast in order to house great hearths, to provide ventilation for smoke, to hold the hundreds of servants who labored within them. The high ceilings and stone walls acted as amplifiers. Every clang echoed, every shout rebounded, filling the chamber not once but twice, as though the walls themselves joined in the uproar. Even footsteps upon the flagstone floors produced sharp claps that resounded through space. In the great kitchen at Hampton Court, for example, one could stand at one end and hear a voice clear at the other, magnified by the chamber's design. Silence was impossible. Sound did not simply live in these rooms. It multiplied. Noise was not limited to work alone. In the brief moments between tasks, servants filled the air with chatter. They gossiped about one another, whispered news of the court, complained about long hours or hard masters. They laughed loudly at jokes that would have seemed small and quiet, but that rang like release in a room where tension always simmered. The kitchen was not only a place of labor, it was a community, one that endured heat, exhaustion, and chaos together. Noise became their bond, their way of affirming that they were not alone in the drudgery. But to the ear of an outsider, the effect was overwhelming, a wall of sound that seemed to press upon the body. Food itself contributed its voice, meat roasted with a hiss, dripping fat into flames with loud pops. Porridges bubbled in great cauldrons, thick liquid blorp, blorp, blorping against the metal sides. Bread crust cracked as it baked, a subtle sound but one noticed by those near enough to hear it. Ale fermented with a soft bubbling, while sauces boiled and spattered when left untended. Even silence in the food was deceptive, for it could be broken at any instant by a sudden sputter or explosion of steam. Cooks learned to listen to these noises as signals. A change in pitch told them a dish was burning. A new rhythm in the bubbling meant it was near ready. Noise was not distraction alone. It was information, an unspoken language shared between food and cook. At times, noise became a weapon. Masters used it to dominate their staff, shouting so loudly that no disobedience could survive. Servants used it to defend themselves, raising their own voices in defiance or complaint. Laughter was wielded as mockery, silence as punishment. The Tudor kitchen was a place of politics as well as cooking, and sound revealed status as clearly as clothing did in the Great Hall. Who spoke loudest, who was heard first, who dared to interrupt. All these were signs of rank, played out daily amid the clamoring of pots and the crackle of fire. But perhaps the most striking truth was this. Those who worked here did not think of the kitchen as noisy at all. For them, it was simply the natural state of existence. They did not long for silence, because silence had no meaning in their world. A quiet kitchen meant no work was being done, no fire burned, no food prepared. Quiet meant hunger. Quiet meant failure. So they embraced the din, even if it deafened them, because the din was life. And when they stumbled out at the end of the day, ears ringing, voices hoarse, they carried that noise in their heads, a phantom chorus that followed them into the night. Yet, as you stand within this imagined scene, a question lingers. If sound defined the Tudor kitchen so fully, what did it do to the people who lived inside it? Did they grow hardened, their senses dulled until only the loudest command pierced their minds? Did they suffer headaches, deafness, or confusion, hidden ailments caused not by heat or smoke but by unending clamor? Or did they perhaps find in the noise a strange kind of comfort, the reassurance that life and labor pulsed on without end? If you close your eyes and imagine stepping further into a Tudor kitchen, the sound grows even sharper, yet so too does the detail. Every task had its own distinct noise, and every noise revealed something about the culture that produced it. The very identity of the kitchen and the people inside could be read through the soundscape. It was not random chaos. It was a structure built on rhythm and necessity, woven into a pattern only those within it could fully decipher. The crack of cleavers on butchers' blocks was among the most dominant sounds. Meat was consumed in staggering quantities in wealthy Tudor households, so carcasses of oxen, deer, pigs, and geese had to be broken down every day. The butcher's task was bloody, repetitive, and violent, but its sound could not be mistaken. The heavy blade descended again and again. Bones splintered, flesh parted, wooden blocks absorbed the strikes, and each impact echoed. That rhythm, dull and pounding, set a pace to which other tasks often adjusted. A servant hauling buckets might pause when the butcher lifted his cleaver, resuming as soon as it fell. The meat's reduction into cuts was not only a necessity but also a kind of metronome for the kitchen itself. Alongside this constant percussion came the sharper clinks and rings of knives against pewter plates or iron pans. Servants sharpened their tools ceaselessly, running blades across whetstones with rasping hisses. Sparks sometimes flew, and the act was both practical and ceremonial. A sharp knife meant faster work, cleaner cuts, fewer accidents. Yet it also meant more sound. One blade being honed made a quiet hiss. A dozen at once turned into a collective shriek, metallic voices raised in unison, bouncing against the kitchen's stone. Noise did not come only from those who prepared food, but from the animals themselves. Livestock were often kept close to kitchens until needed. Geese honked, pigs squealed, chickens clucked in cages. These sounds merged with the labor around them, blending into the human chorus. Imagine the moment when a goose was plucked alive or a pig driven toward slaughter. The cries were piercing, mingling with laughter or complaint, creating moments that were almost unbearable. Servants hardened themselves against such sounds, but they never truly disappeared from the background. Even the flames themselves spoke. Fires roared when fed fresh logs, hissed when fat dripped into them, crackled when kindling caught. Fire demanded constant attention, and it scolded its keepers when neglected. Too much wood, and the flames bellowed smoke into the room, choking servants and darkening the walls. Too little, and the fire died, leaving meat half-roasted, bread underbaked. The fire was not quiet company. It spoke loudly, and those who understood its language knew how to control it. Noise revealed hierarchy in ways subtle and overt. The voices of men often dominated, but women also shouted commands. The female cooks, especially in smaller households, maintained authority with a voice that could cut through the clatter of pans. Servants learned to distinguish whose voice must be obeyed instantly and whose could be ignored for a moment. It was a survival skill. Misjudging a command meant punishment, sometimes physical, sometimes dismissal. Every sound carried meaning, and the absence of a sound carried its own warnings. If the spit turned too slowly, its creak grew irregular. That irregularity was a danger sign. If a boiling pot fell silent, it might have boiled dry. That silence meant disaster for both the dish and the cook responsible. In this way, noise became both alarm and reassurance. To walk into a Tudor kitchen filled with sound was to know that everything was in motion. To walk into a silent one was to sense immediately that something had gone wrong. Beyond labor, noise marked time itself. Bells were struck to signal meals or changes in duty. Hourglasses rattled softly when turned, the sand within whispering its dissent. The clank of lids on cauldrons, the scrape of shovels in hearths, the chiming of ladles against cauldrons, all measured the passing hours as surely as any clock. In fact, for many servants, these sounds were the only reliable indicators of time. When the last loaves left the oven, they knew morning had ended. When the last trenchers were scrubbed, night was near. The clamor replaced clocks. It was a calendar written in sound. One cannot overlook the effect of sound upon the body. The noise was not only heard, it was felt. Vibrations from pounding and chopping traveled through stone floors into feet and legs. The air quivered with the heat's roar, the metallic ringing, the endless conversation. Those who worked here lived inside a sensory storm that wore upon nerves. Some may have grown half-deaf from years in kitchens, their hearing dulled by constant assault. Others likely adapted, training themselves to pick out single voices amid the roar. The noise shaped them, molding not only their tasks but their very senses. And yet, there was also music, not in the deliberate sense, but in the rhythm of coordinated labor. Cooks who stirred in unison created a beat. Bakers slapping dough in time formed a cadence. Servants clashing lids or moving pans made accidental harmonies. Sometimes workers sang over the din, their voices rising defiantly against it. Songs of labor, crude ballads, religious chants, all became layered upon the kitchen's soundtrack. These songs carried morale, lightening burdens, binding the community together. Without them, the noise might have been unbearable. With them, the noise became almost tolerable, even joyful at rare moments. All of this combined to create a truth modern listeners might struggle to grasp. For the Tudors, noise was not a problem to be solved. It was proof of life, proof of industry, proof of prosperity. A silent kitchen fed no one. A noisy one announced to the world that wealth existed, that guests would be fed, that abundance flowed. Noise was reputation, and reputation was survival in a world obsessed with appearances. But here lies the deeper question. What did the constant storm of sound do to the mind of a servant? Did they dream in noise, their sleep filled with phantom clangs and shouts? Did the quiet of Sunday church strike them as alien, a silence almost unbearable after 6 days of tumult? Or did the clamor fade for them, so normalized that they never noticed it at all, while an outsider would have recoiled in shock? If the earlier sounds of the Tudor kitchen created rhythm and structure, the deeper we listen, the more we uncover the hidden consequences of that relentless noise. The very architecture of Tudor houses tells us how seriously the matter was taken. Kitchens in large estates were deliberately built away from the great halls and chambers where nobles dined and slept. Stone passageways, courtyards, or even separate wings separated the cooking quarters from the main residence. This was not simply to prevent the spread of smoke or fire, but also to contain the roar that rose each day. Patrons desired feasts, but they did not wish to hear the clamor that produced them. The ruling classes valued the appearance of order and refinement, while allowing the chaos of sound to remain hidden behind walls. The separation did little to ease the lives of those inside the kitchens. Walls absorbed some noise, but reflected much of it back upon the servants themselves. Imagine the reverberation of 20 voices shouting across stone, the pounding of hammers, the rattle of chains, all bouncing without relief. The echo magnified everything. Servants spoke louder to be heard, which only added to the cacophony. Over hours, the sound became not just a burden to the ear, but to the spirit. In the Tudor kitchen, noise was more than background. It was a tool of discipline. Masters and head cooks often raised their voices above the din to command attention, their words sharp and loud enough to pierce through the ringing of metal. Orders barked at high volume carried authority, and those who failed to obey immediately faced public scolding. A servant humiliated in such a way could not hide. The entire kitchen heard. In this way, noise amplified power. It gave leaders control and reinforced hierarchy. Yet, for the servants themselves, noise could also be resistance. The loud environment made gossip possible. Among clattering pans and creaking spits, servants whispered secrets no master could overhear. Laughter, hidden under the cover of sizzling fat, provided a brief release from the pressure of constant labor. The kitchen became both prison and sanctuary, its walls holding in not only work but the murmured voices of the oppressed. Consider also how the noise shaped the very food produced. With constant shouting and ringing, concentration was difficult. Mistakes were frequent. Dishes burned, sauces soured, bread baked too hard. But noise trained cooks to sharpen their senses beyond hearing. They relied more heavily on sight and smell, learning to read the color of flames, the shimmer of fat, the shade of dough, rather than listening for cues. This adaptation became a hallmark of Tudor cooking skill, resilience against distraction. The social class of servants revealed itself in how they endured sound. Boys or men turning spits often complained of aching heads from the endless creaking chains. Scullery maids suffered ringing ears from endless scrubbing and sloshing water. Senior cooks, hardened by years, claimed not to notice the din at all, though their raised voices told a different story. For them, noise had become a kind of badge, proof of survival in a profession few could tolerate for long. And yet, noise was celebrated in festivals and feast days. When a lord held a banquet, the sound of the kitchen was part of the spectacle. The louder the clatter, the greater the impression of abundance. Guests dining in the hall might not hear it directly, but they knew it existed. Servants sometimes carried dishes into the hall with deliberate noise, metal platters clanging, goblets rattling, so that the company would sense the scale of effort behind the feast. In this way, noise itself became theater, a performance of wealth and power. Noise also defined gender roles within the kitchen. Men were often assigned tasks that produced more sound: cleaving, roasting, pounding. Women took roles whose noise was less violent but equally constant: scrubbing, whisking, grinding. Yet both suffered the effects. The perception of men's sounds as strong and women's as repetitive reflected Tudor beliefs about gender. The division was not only visible but audible, shaping identity in ways often overlooked. Beyond human experience, noise left its mark on the very building. Stone blackened from smoke-absorbed vibrations year after year. Wooden beams warped from the constant banging of pots. Floors worn smooth by dragging cauldrons carried echoes like drums. A Tudor kitchen was not static. It aged with sound, bearing the scars of labor. Archaeologists can still read these scars today, in grooves carved by cleavers, in soot layered thickly on walls. These are physical remnants of a soundscape long vanished, and so we return to the question of endurance. How did servants endure years of this? Did they become immune, or did the noise etch itself permanently into their memory? Perhaps both. There are records of older servants complaining of constant ringing in their ears, a condition we now know as tinnitus. Others described headaches that never left. It is possible that Tudor kitchens slowly damaged hearing across generations, though no one in their time had the words to explain it. Yet, despite the suffering, kitchens remained filled with laughter at times. Noise paradoxically allowed joy. Servants could sing freely, bang pots in jest, mock each other loudly without fear of a master overhearing. Within chaos, freedom lived. Noise, oppressive as it was, also provided cover for humanity. It was a double-edged force, punishing and protective, cruel and comforting at once. The Tudor kitchen was therefore more than a workplace. It was an ecosystem of sound. Noise shaped behavior, enforced discipline, defined class, revealed gender, aged buildings, and left invisible marks upon the body. To understand it is to understand a hidden layer of history, one seldom recorded in text but written every day in echoes and vibrations. And perhaps here lies the haunting thought. In our modern world, we silence kitchens with insulation, with electric machines that hum softly, with designs meant to hide chaos. But in doing so, do we lose something? Do we erase the sounds that once told us who we were, how we worked, how we lived together? Tudor kitchens may have been deafening, but they were alive, and that life was recorded in sound. What would it mean if silence prevailed instead? The longer we remain inside a Tudor kitchen, the more we realize that noise was not simply accidental, but something intentionally created, sustained, and even valued by the society that built these great houses. To understand why, we must look not only at the daily labor but also at the cultural expectations of noise. In the Tudor imagination, sound equaled industry. A silent kitchen suggested idleness. The clatter of pots, the shouting of orders, and the hiss of dripping fat all testified that work was being done. Lords and ladies may not have stepped foot inside the kitchen, but they measured diligence through sound that drifted faintly into adjoining spaces. A loud kitchen was proof of loyalty, service, and abundance. Noise, therefore, became a language of its own. A lord walking near the kitchen wing during preparation for a banquet might pause, hearing the pounding of cleavers and the rush of feet, and feel satisfaction. The servants did not speak to him directly, yet the noise of their labor conveyed a message of devotion and competence. The more noise carried, the stronger the reassurance. This created a paradox. The very noise that tormented servants was the same noise that secured their positions, and possibly their meals and wages. Silence would have been dangerous, a sign of laziness or disobedience. Yet, within that imposed language of noise, subtler signals lived. Servants could communicate through clamor in ways that defied authority. A pot dropped deliberately loud might signal frustration. A broom banged against the floor in a certain rhythm might mark discontent or signal to another servant across the room. Just as field workers developed songs to time their labor, kitchen staff used noise to navigate daily life. This hidden communication shows us that noise was not simply endured, but manipulated. We should also note how noise affected outsiders. For those who visited the kitchen only briefly, messengers, traders delivering goods, or curious guests, the first impression was overwhelming. Contemporary accounts describe the roar of kitchens as astonishing, A traveler in a large household might step through the doorway and feel engulfed by heat, smoke, and a storm of sound, a contrast to the quiet formality of the hall beyond. For visitors, this was a glimpse into another world, one they could hardly imagine sustaining day after day. The consequences of noise stretched into health beyond hearing. Studies of occupational environments in history suggest that relentless loudness, combined with heat and smoke, contributed to fatigue, irritability, and even shortened life expectancy. Servants often worked from dawn until after dark, their bodies strained not only by labor but also by the constant effort to raise their voices above the din. Vocal cords strained, tempers shortened, and small conflicts often exploded into shouts or blows. Noise was both symptom and cause of stress. It also carried into the spiritual life of servants. The kitchen was often located near chapels or great halls where prayers and rituals were held. Imagine the dissonance. Priests chanting softly on one side of a wall, servants yelling over clattering pans on the other. Did this bother the masters, or was it simply accepted as part of the natural order? For servants, the noise of their labor may have drowned out sacred words, reminding them that work consumed all, even the promise of quiet devotion. Perhaps they found spiritual refuge in stolen silences. Late at night after fires were banked, early morning before pots clanged. Those rare moments of stillness must have felt sacred in themselves. We should not forget animals either. Kitchens often house dogs trained to run on treadmills to turn spits. These creatures added their own noises, panting, claws scraping wood, occasional whines of fatigue. The dogs shared the servants' plight, surrounded by noise they could not escape. Their constant motion provided rhythm, their suffering adding yet another layer to the soundscape. Even livestock temporarily kept in courtyards contributed, bleating or squealing before slaughter. Noise was not purely human, but a chorus of species bound together by necessity. As kitchens grew more elaborate through the Tudor period, noise grew as well. Larger households demanded more ovens, more spits, more cauldrons. Scale itself created volume. At Hampton Court, the royal kitchens were said to feed hundreds daily. The noise of such an enterprise must have rivaled a marketplace, each chamber roaring with distinct but overlapping tasks. The sheer size of the building ensured that echoes carried from room to room, blending into a continuous roar. Servants lived inside a perpetual storm, one that could not be escaped unless they left service entirely. Despite its burdens, noise shaped memory. Those who left service later described kitchens in terms of sound rather than sight. They remembered the ringing of cleavers more than the faces of fellow servants. They recalled the crash of platters more vividly than the appearance of dishes. Sound was the strongest imprint, a ghost that followed them long after. This tells us something about human experience, that noise leaves traces as powerful as images, sometimes even more enduring. Noise also forged identity for Tudor society at large. To be a noble was to eat in relative quiet, attended by servants who muted their footsteps, who whispered politely. To be a servant was to live in chaos, battered by sound. The divide was not only of wealth or food, but of sound itself. Silence was a privilege of the elite, noise the burden of the laboring class. This acoustic divide reinforced social order, reminding everyone of their place. When we consider Tudor kitchens in this way, we see them less as chaotic accidents and more as instruments of society deliberately tuned. The kitchen was an engine, and noise was its fuel. Without clamor, the machine would not function, because clamor itself was proof of life. Every dish carried to the table contained not only meat or bread, but echoes of shouts, creaks, hisses, and bangs. The feast was flavored by sound, even if diners never heard it directly. And so, we are left with another question, perhaps the most haunting of all. If the servants had been given the chance to silence the noise, would they have chosen to do so? Or had they become so bound to it that silence itself would have felt alien, even frightening? In the absence of clamor, would they have sensed emptiness or peace? The noise of Tudor kitchens did not stop at the threshold of the great houses. It spilled outward, echoing through courtyards, drifting across gardens, sometimes even disturbing the peace of nearby villages. It carried like an invisible signature of power. Anyone approaching a manor could sense by ear alone that the household was alive and active. The clamor announced wealth because only a rich household required such a scale of labor. A silent house might suggest poverty or decline. Thus, noise was not only an internal burden, but a public proclamation of status. Merchants delivering goods noticed it immediately. A brewer hauling barrels of ale into a courtyard would hear the echo of knives on blocks before he reached the door. A fishmonger bringing baskets of eels would be greeted not by a polite steward, but by a wall of noise, proof that his wares were entering a machine already in motion. He may have felt dwarfed by the magnitude of it all, recognizing that his small trade fed into a system vast and relentless. These impressions reinforced the grandeur of the household. Noise was as much advertisement as architecture, yet not everyone admired it. Clergymen often complained that kitchens disrupted nearby prayer. Letters survived describing the impossibility of focusing on sermons when kitchens roared with preparation for feasts. Some monasteries faced the same dilemma. Should the kitchen be placed closer for convenience, or farther away to preserve silence? The struggle to contain noise was constant. Even when walls were thick, sound traveled through pipes, flues, and stone. Noise, like smoke, found ways to seep into every space. For servants, noise shaped not only their work, but also their sense of time. Before the widespread use of clocks, sound acted as a marker of rhythm. The clatter of cauldrons at midday meant broth was ready. The sudden silence at nightfall meant fires were banked. A dropped ladle could signal urgency. A ringing knife meant haste. Time was not measured by hours, but by tones. To live in a kitchen was to navigate a calendar of noise, where each sound carried meaning. This connection between noise and time also influenced memory. When former servants recounted their years in service, they often dated events by sound. They might remember the day a great platter shattered during Lent, or the evening when a thunderstorm drowned even the loudest voices. The memory of noise became the archive of their lives. Historians can almost reconstruct events from these descriptions, hearing echoes across centuries. Noise further influenced how knowledge was passed down. Training in kitchens relied not on written manuals but on observation and imitation, guided by sound. An apprentice learned to judge a pot's readiness by the hiss of steam, to sense bread by the crackle of crust, to know danger by the sudden roar of a fire flaring too high. Masters did not always explain with words. They expected novices to listen, to internalize the soundscape as instruction. Noise was not only background but pedagogy. To learn the kitchen was to learn its symphony. Noise also created hierarchies among servants themselves. Senior staff, often stationed closer to entrances or more comfortable rooms, could escape the worst of the din, while juniors bore its brunt in the hot central chambers. The privilege of partial silence became a subtle mark of rank. Some fought for positions away from the constant roar, hoping for a corner of comparative quiet. Even within servitude, noise measured status. To rise in the kitchen meant not only better food or pay, but fewer hours shouting over iron. We might wonder whether Tudor society considered this noise excessive. The answer lies in their broader acceptance of sound as part of life. Villages echoed with bells. Markets rang with cries. Blacksmiths hammered day long. People lived immersed in sound far greater than modern ears are accustomed to. Silence was rare and often unsettling. Thus, kitchens did not strike them as unbearable oddities, but as part of a larger culture where sound meant life, growth, and necessity. Only in retrospect do we imagine them as oppressive. Still, there were moments when noise overwhelmed even Tudor tolerance. Festivals and banquets, though joyous for guests, were dreaded by servants because preparations could escalate into near chaos. Imagine preparing for a wedding feast when dozens of dishes had to be timed to perfection. Spits turned without pause, ovens filled and emptied, platters piled high. The kitchen became an earthquake of sound. Servants stumbled out afterward dazed, ears ringing as if after battle. For them, celebration meant exhaustion, with noise as the invisible weapon. It is also important to note how noise interacted with smell, heat, and sight. The sensory overload was complete. Loud clangs combined with thick smoke, the glare of fire, the sting of sweat, the crush of bodies. The servant's body became accustomed to constant assault. And yet, strangely, many endured, year after year. Perhaps they developed tolerance, or perhaps survival required acceptance. To protest would mean dismissal, and dismissal meant hunger. Better to endure noise than face silence and poverty. The persistence of kitchen noise reminds us that history is not only about what was seen or written, but also what was heard. Too often we study the past through texts and images, forgetting that for most people, life was experienced through sound. Tudor kitchens reveal this vividly. They remind us that history was not silent, and that to understand the ordinary we must listen as much as we look. But the question remains. If Tudor kitchens were so noisy, how did servants ever find peace? Did they carve out small refuges for themselves, quiet corners in storerooms, moments outside under the stars? Or did noise follow them always, even in dreams, replaying endlessly in their ears? Noise was more than background chaos. It was also a tool of discipline and control. In Tudor kitchens, the master cook or steward rarely needed to shout specific instructions because the noise itself created a hierarchy. Those closest to the sound of the fire and the chopping blocks were expected to be the most attentive and responsive. The ability to hear commands through the din was proof of both skill and loyalty. A servant who failed to catch a word amid the racket risked mistakes, and mistakes were costly. Burned meat, undercooked bread, spilled sauce, all could be grounds for punishment. Thus, noise was not merely endured, it became a test of competence. Only those who could function within the soundscape rose in rank. Consider the turnspit boys, some of the youngest and poorest workers. Their job was to run inside the wheels that rotated the massive spits of meat, a task that left them exhausted and silent. Yet the creak of the wheel, the groan of gears, the crackle of fire, and the hiss of dripping fat created a cacophony that never ceased. For them, silence was unimaginable. When one wheel stopped, another began. The rhythm of the spits became as steady as a heartbeat, and when it faltered, the entire kitchen noticed. The noise of the wheels was so constant that silence meant something was wrong. Thus, the children's labor was not just physical, but also auditory, contributing to the unbroken pulse of the kitchen. At times, noise offered a strange sort of protection. In a household rife with tension, where rivalries among servants and disputes with masters could turn cruel, the loudness of the kitchen sometimes shielded whispered words. Conversations hidden beneath the clamor were safer than those held in quiet halls. Servants shared secrets, plans, or grievances under cover of banging pots. confident that the noise muffled their voices. The very chaos that exhausted them also gave them small freedoms, brief spaces to speak without fear. In this way, noise carried contradictions. It was both oppression and liberation. The influence of kitchen noise extended even into architecture. Great houses often placed kitchens in separate wings, sometimes at a distance from dining halls or chapels, precisely to contain their sound. Builders knew that no matter how thick the walls, the roar of a busy kitchen would travel. Stone corridors acted as amplifiers, so architects experimented with layouts to reduce the intrusion. Yet complete isolation was impossible. Guests might still hear the muffled thump of cleavers or the faint cry of commands, a reminder that comfort upstairs was purchased by labor below. The design of Tudor estates was shaped as much by acoustics as by aesthetics. One cannot ignore how kitchen noise affected animals as well. Dogs, often kept in kitchens to guard food or clean scraps, lived in a state of constant stimulation. Their barking added to the chaos, especially when deliveries arrived or strangers entered. Rats scuttled, cats prowled, geese honked, all weaving into the orchestra of sound. Animals did not soften the noise but intensified it, each reacting to the others. For servants, this meant living in a perpetual storm of both human and animal voices. Their patience was not only tested by metal and fire, but by fur and feather. The persistence of noise raises a question. How did servants recover? Some likely sought moments of quiet in gardens or stables, far from the hearths. Others turned to prayer where silence was enforced. Still others may have simply grown used to the din, their hearing dulled by years of exposure. Perhaps this explains why many servants in later life described a ringing in their ears, though medical records never named it. What modern science calls hearing damage may have been a hidden consequence of their service. Noise left scars no less real than burns or cuts. Yet, despite all this, Tudor kitchens endured as engines of social order. Without them, great feasts would not have displayed wealth, diplomacy would not have been sealed with meals, and households would not have functioned. The noise was a price paid for civilization itself, a tax in sound. Every banquet that impressed a guest, every dish that strengthened an alliance was born from that clamor. Noise, then, was not just an inconvenience but a cornerstone of power. The Tudor elite relied on it, whether they realized it or not. And so we circle back to a paradox. Tudor kitchens were feared for their deafening roar, yet society depended on that roar to affirm hierarchy, wealth, and survival. Without the endless banging, chopping, sizzling, and shouting, the Tudor world would have seemed strangely hollow. Noise was both a burden and a necessity, both a torment and a proof of vitality. Which leaves us with one lingering thought. If silence had ever descended fully upon a Tudor kitchen, would it have felt like peace, or would it have felt like death? The final consideration of Tudor kitchens and their deafening character is how these sounds echo across history. Imagine walking through a restored Tudor hall today, the dining chamber silent, the hearth unlit. Tour guides describe feasts, but what the modern visitor cannot experience is the noise. It has vanished. Stone walls stand mute, rafters no longer shake, and the air feels still. Yet 5 centuries ago, that silence would have been unthinkable. Kitchens were not only the stomach of the house, they were its lungs and its voice. Their racket was constant breath, constant proclamation that life was being sustained. When sound disappears, history feels hollow. What is lost is not just food or service, but atmosphere, the audible pulse of a civilization. The cooks and servants who endured this clamor did not leave memoirs of their daily lives. Their voices were rarely written down. What remains are the traces. Lists of ingredients, household accounts, architectural blueprints, and the occasional complaint from a noble about the noise. In reading these scraps, one must imagine the missing soundtrack. For every mention of bread baked, one should hear the thump of kneading. For every account of wine ordered, one should hear the clink of bottles and the pop of corks. History records objects and outcomes, but the sensory experience, particularly sound, is often erased. That is why reconstructing the noise of Tudor kitchens becomes more than curiosity. It becomes restoration of lost dimensions of life. The role of noise in shaping social identity also lingers in the broader story of labor. Servants defined themselves by their ability to endure, to survive the crash and roar of their workplace. For the elite, the sounds of the kitchen reinforced their separation from toil. When a noblewoman complained of hearing the banging of pots from her chamber, she was not simply disturbed by volume. She was reminded that her world depended on another class's unending effort. Silence above and noise below mirrored the silence of privilege and the clamor of survival. Thus, Tudor kitchens were not just noisy. They were symbols. They broadcast the hierarchy of sound, where quiet meant wealth and noise meant labor. Consider also the psychological endurance required. A servant might wake before dawn to the sound of iron on wood and fall asleep at night with the echoes still ringing. Noise could not be switched off like modern machines. It was life's constant companion. Over time, workers may have grown numb to it, but numbness is itself a scar. The shaping of minds by noise is an unspoken legacy. Those who lived in the kitchen world carried its rhythms in their bodies even after they left service. Perhaps the pace of chopping haunted their dreams, or the roar of the fire rang in their ears. The endurance of Tudor servants was not only physical, but sensory, surviving in a world that never quieted. The broader implication is that soundscapes are as much a part of history as architecture or clothing. When one pictures Tudor life, one should not imagine serene portraits alone, but the orchestra of labor that fed them. The Tudor kitchen was not a backdrop, but a stage, where noise itself performed. Each bang of the hammer and each shout of command was a line in a script written by necessity. To ignore the noise is to misunderstand the drama. In the end, what lingers is the paradox. Tudor kitchens were dreaded by those who worked within them, yet essential for the glory displayed by those who dined outside them. They were loathed as unbearable, yet they embodied survival. They were chaotic, yet they produced order in the form of meals, banquets, and sustenance. The noise was both torment and triumph. It defined an era as surely as its politics and wars. And so, one might ask, if you were to close your eyes and step into a Tudor household, would you prefer the hushed chambers above, where silence was a mark of wealth? Or would you descend into the kitchen, where the relentless roar of labor spoke the true heartbeat of the age?